right. Thank you so much for joining us. You're either watching or listening to The Climb, and I'm Jon Rakowich, and this is brought to you by the Digital Mastermind. The Digital Mastermind is a group of digital agency owners, marketers, technologists that get together, collaborate, sharing the latest tips, tricks, tools, secrets, whatever they can do to help each other's agencies grow. If you would like to join, go ahead and shoot me an email, Jon, at digitalmastermind.com. Today, we have a special guest. Walt Rakowich. He was the CEO of an S&P 500 company, Prologis, and he brought that company back from the brink of bankruptcy. So before we get into all that, I'd like to welcome my co-host out here, Dave. Dave, why don't you go ahead and join us?
Hey, how's it going?
Hey, good to see you.
Good to see you.
So there was a lot of takeaways from this interview. I think one of those was him defining vulnerability as humility. I think that was one of the big takeaways for me. What were some of the ones for you?
Well, what I really liked is, and I guess, at the time when I was listening to it, I was like, it's not that big of a deal. But how he really committed to getting to know his team and his employees. And after the interview, it was like time for lunch. And, I was like, you know what? I should, follow this guy's, lead and use this as an opportunity to reach out to some people on the team. So I reached out to a team member and said, hey, you want to come out for lunch? And she couldn't. She was busy. But then, when I was there, thank goodness I didn't change locations. But, one of our other team members showed up and I ended up having a great conversation, just getting his temperature check on where we're going and benefits. And we got to talk about a lot of stuff. So I just remember, I remember messaging you going, hey, because of that interview, I'm sitting right here eating lunch with one of our team members. So,
I think that's one of the other things that he nailed in to make sure that Prologis was successful was making sure that everybody feels connected, right?
Right.
And that's something that's integral for culture. If people feel disconnected, well, they're not going to be connected to their work and they're not going to be connected to the other people that they're working for, nor the mission, nor the values.
Or the outcome.
Right. Yeah. What's the point for them?
Right.
The other thing that he brought up was that I mentioned earlier was the vulnerability side of things. And we actually, it was one of the debates we got into with the guy that recommended Walt was Jeff Nischwitz. And I struggle with that word. Maybe it's the old school leadership or my upbringing, because as Walt even defines in this, vulnerability is its weakness, right? In a lot of ways. But like I said, he defined it as humility. But one of the questions in there where he gets into, all right, what is the downside of vulnerability? And I'm happy that we covered that, because this is something, whether it's Brene Brown or everybody that's talking about it, it's in the zeitgeist. And I think people, especially leaders, if they go down the wrong path, well, if they're a leader, they're going to take their people down the wrong path. And you and I have seen this for years with, certain agencies. So I thought it was a really rewarding podcast or episode of the podcast. And I'm really happy that he was able to make the time for us.
Yeah, I really enjoyed it. I liked the conversation when we got into like, how do you make decisions? What are the the factors that you take into account to make decisions of leadership? And when you go through that, I really enjoyed our back and forth on that. So it's the humility of how to make decisions. It's what do you think about when you're making decisions for your company, and what's your primary driving factor? I mean, I think that I really enjoyed that aspect of the interview. Yeah.
You had great feedback too. Being the change that you want to see, I think, is something that I said to that. Have you, what was I think we've talked about this in the past, but I don't recall, who have you worked for somebody that was just inherently unhumble, that was just a braggart?
Yeah, of course. Usually in the corporate world. But I'll tell you an interesting story. The company that recruited me down to Florida had essentially two leaders. I mean, there was a CEO and then there was the CIO, but they were essentially partners. But definitely one had to be, noted as the CEO, and maybe the other one had a majority stake or whatever it was. But the CTO, actually, not CIO, CTO, he used to jump up on the table. We used to work in a big pit, and there was probably 150 developers or technologists all in this one giant room. And out of nowhere, he would jump up on a table and go, "Woo! right? And everybody would go like, what? And then he would deliver this awesome and inspirational, just a little nudge in the middle of the day because he knew we were grinding, right? And then the other boss was kind of just like the braggart and didn't really bring anything inspirational to it. And it was interesting once they kind of they didn't go live. They got acquired. Oh man, all that lost, all that spirit and energy just disappeared. And then I left soon after that. I'm a perfect example of the second the culture changed. I was like, there's no point in staying here anymore.
Disconnected, man. Yeah.
Yep.
I worked for a really passionate guy. It was a mentor before he passed, and he would tell these just really glowing stories that would pull everybody in, and he'd start crying a little bit, but not too much. And it was just enough to make everybody, get to the edge of the cliff and grow wings so they could, take it to the next level. So yeah, I'm a firm believer of that.
I don't know if I would ever get to the point of crying.
It's everybody, but it's like a fingerprint, man. It's what works for you, and what worked for him isn't necessarily going to work for somebody else. So you gotta treat it like a buffet, and take what works for you.
Yeah.
Yeah, I know a lot of people, and maybe this is something that's more common, and maybe it was in the early 2000s, the crying thing. Like, I think I'm gonna cry, man.
Oh, you're talking about it right now. The vulnerability.
Right.
Everyone's talking about how to be vulnerable.
Yeah. The other thing too, though, is I know a lot of people now like, oh, this is giving me goosebumps. Dude, I swear, like I'll have a couple calls with people and like I'm hearing them talk and they're like, oh, this is giving me goosebumps. I'm like, is this everybody just getting goosebumps talking to me, or is this the new crime?
I think it's the new emotional state of the American worker. For someone that, if you're not in touch with some emotionality, then you're not going to be connected with anyone. Everyone's got to feel an emotional attachment to everything they do now.
Yeah. I think it's a balance though, right? Because if you're robotic, you're not going to be able to connect with anybody.
Right.
And I think the word I'm looking for is you got to be genuine about it. If you're disingenuous about it, that is just like, it's the worst.
Right. Yeah. You got to be authentic to yourself.
Yeah. It's like watching a movie, which is terrible acting. You're like, yeah, we're watching you try to pretend. Yeah. Not good.
Poorly.
Yeah. But Waltz, taking it back to that, was able to connect. I mean, in one part in there, he even talks about somebody that's still talking to him years later that's been with the company for 30 years, right, that I believe was like a janitor. So without any further ado, Dave, is there anything else you'd like to say on this before we introduce this awesome episode to our guests?
No, I think the audience is going to enjoy it, and I know I did.
Boom. Bingo, bango. Everybody, please listen to Walt Rakowich and go ahead and like, subscribe, comment, share, any way that you can participate to the show. If you really hate it, just go ahead and shoot me an email, jon@digitalmastermind.com. Thank you so much for listening. Here's the episode. All right. Hey, Walter, thank you so much for joining us.
Great to be on, Jon. Thanks so much.
Oh, my pleasure. No, really appreciate you making the time. So what I'd like to get into first is you to give our listeners an idea of your climb. Like, what is your journey? Like, how did you get here?
Yeah. Well, first of all, I grew up in the great city of Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. And, but I would just say that my leadership journey was molded by so many things, not the least of which was my upbringing. I always say people, I was fortunate to hit the parent lottery, and my mom and dad, they didn't really have a lot of wealth, but what they gave me was a lot of wealth of love and support. And they're incredibly upbeat people. And, they really appreciated people for who they were as opposed to who they had. And I think that had a great influence on, my leadership journey. And I had plenty of things over my career that influenced me, but probably the most important one and the one that inspired me to write the book Transfluence was the challenge that I faced at Prologis when I was asked to be CEO. Just leading into that, during that time, Prologis is a very large company in the S&P 500 and basically the largest owner of industrial real estate in the world. And I sort of had risen through the ranks of the company. I was regional vice president, chief financial officer, number 2 person as the president and chief COO. And I worked for a guy, the CEO, who was probably the most brilliant person I ever met on one hand, and on the other hand had some real leadership flaws. I mean, he was a person that believed that he was always right, and paid little attention to what others had to say, and in some cases twisted the truth, John. And so, I sort of had an example of what I didn't want to lead by, and I went to the board of directors and ultimately left the company because I didn't want to work underneath of that regime. And when I had left the company, the stock price was at $72 a share. It's very, very strong company. And by November of that year, this was in January, by November of that year, in 10 short months, the stock price had fallen from 72 to 2. So we were down 95%. We were the 3rd worst performing stock in the S&P 500. We were on the verge of bankruptcy, and the board of directors asked me to come back and essentially lead the company. And I knew it was going to take a Herculean effort, and but I agreed to do it. And I saw that our people had lost confidence in leadership. And I would just end by saying this. I think people learn the most in crucible moments, and sometimes crucible moments are our best opportunities. And for me, I didn't know it at the time, but it really was my best opportunity to lead. And I learned a lot about leadership over the next 4 years in trying to turn around the company, which we successfully did. And that really led me to write the book Transfluence, which is all about transformational leadership. And anyway, I'm sure we'll get into stories as we go on, but that was really the crucible moment, is what led me to think about leadership the way that I do.
And what exactly was that crucible moment?
Well, the crucible moment is when they asked me to come back and walk into a company that was on the verge of bankruptcy. And how do you do that? What is that? How do you lead? How do you inspire people? How do you lift them up? How do you get them to do things that are extraordinary things? And so that crucible moment wasn't just one moment. It really took place over the course of the next 2 to 3 years. But ultimately we got through it.
And what would you say was the transformational? Like, how did you develop like that path? Was it something where you just sat down and said like, okay, hey, I'm going to go ahead and list this out, and this is my plan? Was it more organic? Can you kind of talk us through that and what that looks like?
I think it's all about, I know we'll get into this, but it's really all about how you treat people.
Okay.
At the end of the day. And that's what the book Transfluence is all about. How do you lift people up? How do you get them to do the things you want to do? Essentially, to me, leadership starts with the notion that it's not about you. And most leaders actually think it's about them. In fact, it's not about them. It is all about the influence that you have on other people, influencing them to do big and great things. And by the way, influencing them might mean from time to time being vulnerable, and doing difficult things that leaders have to do, that don't seem right to do, but at the end of the day get results.
So how can leaders be more vulnerable with their staffs and their team?
Well, first of all, this word vulnerable is kind of a tough word. If you look it up in Webster's dictionary, you'll or online, you'll see words like weak, you'll see words like defenseless, you'll see words like woundedness. And by the way, it's easy to understand why a leader wouldn't want to be that way. I wouldn't want to be that way.
Right.
I don't think you get results that way. But I define it much more from the perspective of humility. I define it from the perspective of being a humble leader, right? So it's not about being weak, but it's about recognizing that you have weaknesses and being open to them. It's not about being defenseless, but it is about recognizing the fact that you need to be a servant leader and you need to understand other people's views before you can lead. And so it's a humility that would say, I need to ask, listen, and be open to change. I need to ask, listen, and be open to other people's ideas. I need to ask, listen, and be open to the fact that I might be wrong or that I don't have the answer. And that's sometimes very difficult to do. And I'll tell you a real quick story that happened to me. So it was a month after I came back, and myself and a bunch of finance people were all sitting in the room. It was 1 o'clock in the morning, and we were doing everything we could to save the company. And one of my finance people said to me, "Well, I got some bad news. We're going to blow our bond covenants on about $10 billion in bonds." And I said, "Well, when's that going to happen?" He said, "Next quarter, because we're not going to hit our earnings." And he said, and I said, "Well, what does that mean?" He said, "Well, I don't see any other way. I mean, we got to have to declare bankruptcy." And I got white as a ghost. And I said, "You guys mind if I leave the room for a minute?" They said, "No." And I walked down the hallway, and I saw this chair. I was ready to faint in the distance. And I beelined to the chair, and I didn't make it. And my head hit the corner of the desk and split open.
Oh,
And I was laying on the ground for about 10 minutes. And then after 10 minutes, I woke up, man, I had no idea where I was. And all of a sudden I thought, oh my gosh, these people are all still in the room waiting for me. So I ripped off to the bathroom. I kind of sutured it up, stopped the bleeding, walked into the room. And I said, "Well, let's talk about this bankruptcy issue." And my CFO looked at me and said, No, well, let's talk about that god awful lump on your head. How in the hell did that happen? And I said, I looked around the room and I thought it was a moment of vulnerability. I looked around the room and I said, "You know what, guys? I fainted. And you know what? The CEO is supposed to have all the answers. And you know what? I don't have one answer. I don't know." I said, "The answer lies with all of you. And I'm in a vulnerable moment," right? And it was like a moment of silence. And someone finally turns around and he said, "Walt, don't worry about it. You've empowered us. Give us a chance and we're going to figure this out." And you know what? They came up with the answers, not me. And I realized that sometimes by letting your guard down, sometimes by putting yourself in that moment of vulnerability, people actually look at you as if you're like them, because they know that they all have been vulnerable many, many times, right? And if you want to create communication in your organization, real communication, open your kimono up like that. And that's what happened to me. And so, yeah, was it a moment of weakness? Yeah. But really what it was a moment of openness, humility, where they had the opportunity to shine and where they did ultimately. And that's how we created teamwork within the organization. That's what I mean by a moment of vulnerability. And by the way, vulnerability used in the right way, not always, but in the right way, can be a very, very powerful motivator for other people.
yeah. Like what are some downsides of vulnerability? Because like you said, when you defined it, like I instantly go to the weakness side and a lot of those negative things. So can you go into any of the downsides?
So, there are perceived downsides. And if you do it wrong, those downsides can be real. Being taken advantage of, not seen as decisive, not followed as a leader, people thinking that you're not promotable. I mean, that's a lot. Those are pretty heavy duty things. And so I don't think you should always be vulnerable. Okay. But I'm not talking about indecisiveness here. I mean, indecisive leaders don't make it, right? I'm talking about courage. I'm talking about doing things that take courage, having courage to listen, having courage to be human around other people, having courage to be wrong and admitting you're wrong. Okay. I think human leaders get results. And again, leaders that can't make decisions don't get results. Don't get me wrong. But I'm not talking about that. Hopefully you're beginning to understand what I am talking about. I'm talking about a humanity about yourself, an openness, a transparency that sometimes is really, really hard for leaders to do.
So and might be more of a cultural question, but like, how do you not get taken advantage of by being vulnerable?
I think there's two things. Number one, I think you have to be transparently clear about how you operate and what you expect from people and what the consequences are in the event that someone does take advantage of you. And number two, I think you have to show decisiveness. Back to what I just said a minute ago. You have to be an action-oriented leader. That doesn't mean that you don't listen. That doesn't mean that you don't take in what other people have to say. But at the end of the day, you're a leader and you have to make decisions. And if you can't make decisions, you won't be there for long. And that might actually mean taking decisions and actions on people that do take advantage of you, putting them in their place. That's okay. Everybody needs to see that. At the end of the day, you have to set the example, but you have to be open enough to listen to other people, hear what they have to say, but respected enough to know that they know that you'll ultimately make the decision. And you know that that's in your sphere of responsibility. And I think if you are transparent, if you do set the expectations as to how you operate and what you expect from people, you show that decisiveness, people will respect that.
Got it. And so a lot of this, like vulnerability, being transparent, that's what you cover a lot in the book. This is essentially Transfluence, right?
Well, yeah, I think that's a big part of it. And,
Okay.
and humility and honesty and heart. I talk about the 3H core as well in the book. And so, yeah, those are huge things.
So, and I love all these qualities. To me, sound like fantastic companies to work for, right? Like who would not want to work with those companies? But there are the companies that are maybe stuck in more of a 1980s way of thinking, or even like that 90s crush it way of thinking. What's in the way of companies embracing a lot of those tenets of what Transfluence is?
Yeah, I wouldn't say that companies embrace it. I would say people embrace it. People are made up. Companies are made up of people, right? So I think the biggest issues fall within leadership, not within companies. They fall within specific leaders in companies. And I talk about in the book, the two biggest challenges that leaders have are pride and fear. And I'll talk a little bit about both of them. First, pride.
Mm-hmm.
I actually think authentic pride is quite good. Like, for example, I have pride in my kids' accomplishments. I have pride in ultimately, where Prologis is today. I have pride in my marriage, that kind of thing. But I think where pride really runs amok is hubris, what I call in the book hubristic pride, mm-hmm. which is really all about vanity, egotism, arrogance, narcissism. I mean, you look at the problems that took place at FIFA, the soccer organization, you look at the problems that took place at Volkswagen with the emission scandals, GM, Theranos, the blood testing company, Prologis in 2008. It's all caused by pride and leadership that focused within themselves. And then there's this notion of fear. And I think some fear is actually quite good. I think I say in the book that Taylor Swift said that every time she gets up in front of 15,000 people, she's fearful, her heart is pounding, but it actually elevates her to a different performance level. That fear is good. The problem is that most fear is actually bad. It's not good. And it's because it's about the leaders themselves. So Harvard Business Review did an article a couple of years ago, which was called "What Do CEOs Fear?" And actually, they interviewed over 100 C-suite executives, and they said, what are your biggest fears? And you know what the interesting thing is? You thought that they'd say, well, the competition. I fear losing my people. I fear profitability in the company. Blah blah blah. No. All the fears were about the leaders themselves. The number one fear was incompetence. And CEOs talked about how it, led them to be more dictatorial because it was like the imposter syndrome. Should they really be in the job? And so they became dictatorial. Well, this is the way that it's got to be. The number two fear was underachievement. Someone else will do it better than me. And so I'm going to underachieve. So I got to overpay for these assets, or I've got to buy this company because if I don't, my competitors will. And the number three fear was appearing too vulnerable. Back to your question, the fear of not being relevant in their jobs. See, these are the kinds of fears to me that destroy trust in an organization. When leaders are sort of all about themselves, okay, people don't really trust you.
Mm-hmm.
And you got to get out of that. You got to move on from that. And so back to your question, I think what holds companies back, or what holds leaders back, are themselves. It's about their pride and their fear, and they got to get out of that.
How do you overcome that?
I think you got to look outside of yourself. I have a whole chapter devoted to it. Look, I think we live in a world of self-promotion. We live, social media is our medium to promote ourselves. And I say in the book, be selfless and be different. Picture an organizational chart with you as the leader. Instead, a pyramid. Instead of you being at the top, flip the pyramid and put yourself at the bottom. I had a really great interview with Frank Blake, who was the former CEO of Home Depot.
Mm-hmm.
And I wrote about this in the book. I said, Frank, so how do you lead your people? And he said, Walt, I lead it by the flip pyramid. And I said, what the hell's that? Excuse my. And so he said, well, I'm the CEO. And so I'm at the bottom of the pyramid. Okay. And then the flip pyramid, that is.
Yeah.
And the next thing is, if you will, the corporate support. And then there's the field support above them. And then there's the frontline associates above them. And then there's the customers above them. And he said, that does three things. And he said, the first thing is it underscores the importance of integrity, because leaders are in a weight-bearing position. You're at the bottom, man. And it's like you're holding this side and this side together, right? And an organization without integrity is going to fracture. So you need to have incredible integrity to hold this pyramid up. He said the second thing is it recognizes that the most important stuff actually happens above you. Okay. And so that you must center your attention on other people, and you've got to cater to them. And you have to realize that there's no room for pride as a result of that. And the third thing is you have to understand, as a leader, it's all uphill. Gravity is against you. So when you communicate, for example, a vision, you've got to communicate it over and over and over. Otherwise, people won't understand, which puts you outside of yourself. No, it's not about saying it once and everybody gets it. Actually, that doesn't happen. What you have to do is say it numerous times and people get it. And so I think the way that you push yourself out of your own way is to, in essence, humble yourself, put yourself at the bottom of the pyramid, and actually begin to think about, what does leadership look like when you're at the bottom, not at the top? I think it's a very interesting analogy.
Yeah, no, I like that perspective too. And I think the other point is, and it's something I've said, I've heard in the past as well. For a vision or anything that you want to change, you need to become a chief repetition officer. You have to keep repeating and repeating and repeating those things to happen.
Absolutely.
So what would you say about a business that's failing today? Like, what can and what should they do?
Well, a leader, typically a business is failing, not always, but many times it's because of leadership. I've seen people lead bad business ideas, but they're great leaders, and somehow they make it work. And then you can take a great idea, but be a bad leader and run it into the ground. I really believe it's about leadership. And I think it sounds basic, but leaders need to be willing to ask, listen, and be accountable. There's those words again. And I think you might ask, well, okay, how do you do that? I was really fortunate that the company was willing to hire a coach for me. And in fact, then I took that coach and the top people in the whole company got coached. And so, but if you don't have the money for that, hire a personal board of directors. Find yourself in an accountability group. Do some personality testing on yourself. Make sure you're receiving 360-degree evaluations in everything you do, right? Because at the end of the day, you want people to tell you and be willing to tell you how you're doing as a leader and what can you do better. And ultimately, I think if you don't ask, listen, and then be accountable, realize that you're accountable to other people, you'll never get there. You'll never get there.
So it's okay. I like that. It sounds like you need multiple different things that are adding perspective and continually giving you a feedback loop, whether it's the coach, the board of directors, or whatever these things are. You need some type of system that's giving you that reflection.
That's exactly right, John. But setting up that system is easier said than done.
Right.
And the most important thing for me was a coach, because a coach actually came in and interviewed all the people that worked for me, interviewed my board of directors who I worked for, interviewed even my spouse, and told me a lot about myself that I didn't know.
Wow, they interviewed your wife?
Oh yeah. Absolutely.
That is hardcore, man.
I know. And of course they expect to hear nothing but good things, but sometimes you never know. I mean, but you know what? You find you learn a lot about yourself, and you learn things that you could do much better. And so I think back to your question, look, failing businesses, I think failing businesses are all about 9 times out of 10 are about failing leadership. And if you dig really deep, they have some of the pride and the fears that I was talking to you about earlier. And I really believe that in order to get out of that, you got to understand, it starts with really understanding a lot more about yourself and what people think of you and how you can improve. And when that happens, I think you can get the results that you're looking to get in your business. All things being equal. Sometimes you just have a bad business. Let's face it.
Yeah, amen to that.
9 times out of 10, it's much deeper than that.
Yeah, I love that. And like, if you had to choose like one leadership lesson that's helped you out today, like what would that be? And can you share that?
Yeah. So when I went to business school, I had a friend that ultimately became my best man in my wedding.
Yeah.
And I noticed that when I got together with him, he always asked me a few questions about what was going on in my life before I could even start asking him or even talk about what I had on my mind. He was terrific at asking questions before anything happened. And I realized that he cared about me. And the first lesson is always show you care about people. I think you do that by taking an interest in people. And I think you show that you take an interest in people by learning about them. So when I go into a meeting, the one way that I prepare for just about every meeting I go into is I ask myself, what are 3 questions that I want? What is the interest of the people that I'm going in to meet with? And what are the 3 questions that I can ask them that will begin to open up, if you will, my relationship with them? And there's another thing that I would say that I do a LinkedIn Live interview with somebody every month. And last month, I did it with Cheryl Batchelder, who's the former CEO of Popeye's Louisiana Chicken. And she said something very interesting to me, which I actually agree with, but I never thought of. It's subliminal, but it's called eye contact. I think it's when you make eye contact with somebody, as opposed to looking at your iPhone or looking around. Do you ever have a conversation with somebody where they're kind of looking around like this and you don't feel like they're interested in you?
Yeah, all the time.
And she said, well, don't ever underestimate the importance of eye contact in every conversation that you have, because it shows respect. It shows that individual that you're giving them your full attention. And so I think really leadership is about showing that you care. It's about not wanting to tell people about yourself, but wanting to ask people questions about themselves before you even begin to talk. And I think it's about making eye contact with people. And that all is within the realm of showing respect and that you care. You show that, people will kill to work for you over time.
I like that. Would you say that, or is there anything else as a common leadership mistake leaders are making today?
I think the common leadership mistake that people make is they're focused on results and not the journey. And I have to admit, I'll tell you a story about a coach story of what he told me. But let me just say this: when I came to work, my result was turn the company around, stupid. I mean, that's what you know. If I had a bottom line and the board of directors told me that was the bottom line, it would be turn the company around. That's what you got to do. Okay, no matter what it takes. I would say that the leadership journey, though, that was more important was, or my objective, if you will, was to influence the lives of the people that I led, because I wasn't going to turn the company around. They were. So when I hired this coach, coach comes in, and like I told you a minute ago, he did all these extensive 360-degree evaluation and, evaluation on personality testing, all this stuff, right? Blah, blah, blah. It comes back to me. The first meeting he said is, okay, Walt, so I've got some good news and I've got some bad news for you. I said, okay, give me the good news. He said, the good news is people really love working for you. I said, that's great. What's the bad news? And he goes, the bad news is your empathy scores aren't all that high. I go, what? Ouch. What do you mean? Like, I care about people, right? I mean, I pride myself in caring about people. He said, no. He said, maybe you think you do, but here's what your subordinates are telling me. They're telling me that you're running around like a chicken with your head cut off, trying to save the company. And they don't feel comfortable walking into your room, not because you're going to shoo them out, but because you're too busy, perceived to be too busy to talk to them. And nobody likes to bother a CEO who is really, really busy. He said, so here's the deal, Walt. Look less busy, get around and know people, build your relationships, and let them turn the company around. Don't worry about it yourself. And I thought that was really, it was like putting a dagger in my heart, right? And I began to think about, I was so focused on the results and not enough focused on the journey. And the journey in getting those results is lifting up people and making them feel great about what they did and where they worked and how they do a better job at what they do. In other words, it's about influencing them to be better. And if I did that right, we could lead the company out of the mess it was in. And so I became more focused on that over time and less focused on getting to the results. You know what? We got the results anyway.
Yeah. Did you, like, consciously with that feedback try not to look busy? Or like somebody would come in and you would, instantly lock onto them?
Well, it's a great question. And we actually put a plan in place. I mean, we were intentional about it. And I'm not making this stuff up, man. You have to be intentional about it. So one of the things that I started to get intentional about was we had a cafeteria downstairs. And, I traveled 4 out of 5 days a week. So I was only in the office 1 day a week. And of course, when you're in there, your propensity is to meet with your direct reports because you haven't seen them, and you gotta, your CFO and your head of HR and, blah, blah, blah. Okay. Well, I started realizing that I couldn't do that. And what I needed to do the one time I was in the office was go down to the cafeteria, walk around, whoever was in front of me, I tapped them on the shoulder. It could be Joe in accounting, and it could be, Mary in IT. Tap them on the shoulder, tell them I'm going to buy them lunch, sit down and start asking them questions about their family. And I started doing that religiously. And it got me out of my own, cocoon.
Yeah.
And also it had the impression that everybody wanted to see, which is Walt's out of the ivory tower. He really does care about us. Look at him talking to Mary in accounting over there.
Right.
And then Mary in accounting would say, he surprised the heck out of me because he just asked me about my husband and my kids the whole time. He never asked me a question about what was going on in accounting. The questions that you would never think that a CEO would ask me, he asked me. And I think, that's just one thing, but that was intentional. And I did it when I realized that I had to get out of my own skin. And I think
Yeah.
it was effective in the company.
You got personal with them.
I got personal with them.
What would you say is a big myth about leadership? Like what is it, and how could you get away from them if you have one?
So I'm going to flip that. And I'm going to say the same thing I just said it. And that is the greatest myth is that leadership is about getting results.
Mm.
And particularly financial results. And that it doesn't really matter how you get there, but you keep score in terms of how you get results.
Yeah.
I actually think that's wrong. I think I think that you actually keep score by the difference that you make in the lives of other people. That's harder to keep score, but how much you make them better, and that's leadership. And I had numerous stories to prove that internally. But at the end of the day, people respond to human leaders that care about them. They do the job that you want them to do. And remember the flip pyramid. What they do is actually more important than what you do. They touch the customers every single day. You don't.
Right.
And you got to make sure they're happy. And they're satisfied and they feel educated and they feel cared about. And so actually, I think how you influence them, while it's more nebulous to count and it more subjective, I should say, I think that's actually how you keep score.
So did you work for some of, like you mentioned the one leader that you worked for? You said it was a brilliant guy. Like, did you have like a whole career of working for those types of people and having like the opposite of what you see today, of what you've created?
I had all kinds of bosses in my life. I had good bosses and bad bosses. I had a great boss, but I didn't have him as a boss until I was 27 years old. And all the people I was in business school for 2 years, but for the 4 years that I worked prior to that, I can only think of maybe one or two good bosses, and I could probably think about 4 or 5 pretty bad ones.
Yeah.
So I had a number of different good and bad bosses, but my first really good boss was a boss that I had at 27 years old, who did exactly what I'm talking about. He took an interest in me. He took an interest in the people around him. He took us on leadership trips every year. We did trips in Wyoming where we herded 500 and some odd cattle from 6,500 feet up in the Laramie Mountains down to 5,000 feet, and then we pregnancy tested these cows. Wow. I mean, we did biking trips. We did trips where we took mules up the Monument Valley, up the buttes in Monument Valley. And we took all kinds of trips every year, and because he was all about, making our team better, and making sure that we gelled as a team. And I look back on that and I think, man, that's what real leadership is about. That's somebody that cares about you.
Yeah. And along those lines, right? So let's say you're the leader of a company, you have another management layer that then manages the people under them. How do you make sure that they're taking care of the culture and they're, following the vision?
Communication. It's not just how you act, it's what you do. It's not just the way you think about them, it's how you prove it. And I think communication, I think back to the inverted pyramid, I think you cannot communicate once. You got to communicate over and over and over, because the one thing I found out at work is that people don't get it the first time. They don't even get it the second time. So you have to reinforce it over and over and over. In Prologis, we had over 100 offices worldwide, in Europe, Asia, Central America, South America. And so I traveled a lot. I traveled about 300,000 miles a year in an airplane.
Wow.
And when I would go into the offices, I made sure that I just didn't meet with the person who ran the office, but I met with the entire group of people. And I would sit down with them. And most of our offices were no more than 20 to 25 people. So you could fit everybody in a conference room. And I would tell them about the vision of the company, and I'd tell them about the progress of the company. And I always said to them, my line is open. I know that sounds really weird, but my line is open. And if you don't want to call me, just email me. Feel free to do that. Just know that I'm probably going to talk to your supervisor, unless it's something confidential. I might tell your supervisor that you touch base with me, but that's okay. I mean, I'm open for that. And it was really interesting. I left the company 7.5 years ago, and I still get an annual email from a maintenance worker in Los Angeles who touches base with me, asks me how I'm doing, and sometimes even asks me for advice on, and he still works for the company. And it's just amazing to me that, and I look back on it, that I was able to create enough comfort where a maintenance worker, which for us it would be a blue collar worker, actually still feels comfortable touching base and talking with me. And that's really what you want to create when you go out. I mean, you got to touch and feel people. That this world that we live in with this virtual world is cool in some respects, but you still got to get out as a leader and touch and feel people, right? You have to take them to dinner. You have to sit in conference rooms. You spend time with them. And it's that time that you go over the vision over and over and over. And hopefully at some point in time, people get it.
Yeah. You got to press the flesh and smell the breath.
There you go. That is exactly right.
So it sounds like you live and created a value-based organization, and you're talking about there's other people in the organization. Like, how can the people that work for you identify their core values, or a company identify their core values? Because it seems like that's something that we keep, touching on, but haven't really spoke to yet.
I do think you have to be, well, in terms of the company, you do have to be intentional about it. We had opportunities to sit down as a management team and say, what's important to us. Just before I left, we had one of those sessions, and it was really an all-day session where we basically sat down, we threw a bunch of words up, and we began to pick through the words that actually meant something to all of us. And over time, sometimes those words may change, but I think we created what the core value was. And I don't think the way to do it is, as the leader, as the CEO of the company, say, these are my 6 core values. This is the way we're going to run the company. It's got to be an iterative approach, and it has to well up from the organization. Some organizations actually begin to take surveys and actually talk to their employees about, what's important to them before they come to their core values. In terms of your own personal values, I think, I really thought about that, the answer to that. And I think leadership is always put to a test in crucible moments, like I talked about in the beginning. And I think it's important for us, for ourselves to look back individually at those crucible moments in our lives and say, how did I deal with that? And ask what I might have done differently if you weren't happy with how you disposed of that crucible moment. And I think that will actually help you uncover what's important. In my case, I left the company in 2008 because the CEO of the company asked me to do, well, there was a number of reasons, but he asked me to do something that I thought was completely unethical, which was to go into the board of directors, support him in doing a transaction that I didn't think we should do. And since I was on the board with him, he said, under no uncertain circumstance do I want you to vote no for this. I want you to vote with me on this. And I said, well, I can't do that. And ultimately I left the company. And I did it because, and at the time, it forced me to think about how I deal with dilemmas in my life and what are my non-negotiables. In my non-negotiables, the litmus test, if you will, for the decisions I make are 3 things. 1, I want to be a man of excellence. 2, I want to be a man of integrity. And 3, I want to be a person who's accountable to other people. And in my case, accountable to a higher being. And when I created those 3 things as my litmus test, and I looked at what he asked me to do, I couldn't be any of those. but I certainly couldn't be number two, a man of integrity. And I certainly couldn't be a man who's accountable to do the right things, really. And so those are my non-negotiables. And I think sometimes, what I advise people to do is to look back on your crucible moments and ask yourself, how did I solve this? What were my non-negotiables? And how do I use those non-negotiables in all that I do? And I think it will, look, at the end of the day, I think that becomes your core value or your core values.
Yeah.
How you do it in an organization, you have to remember that everybody has different values. So it becomes a little more of a negotiation when there's a lot of people involved. But when it's just you, there is no negotiation. You can figure that out. It's what's important to you that counts.
So
yeah. Oh, good, Dave.
Yeah, what that sounds to me is, and how I like to approach things is what I heard you say is, or what I do is I project when it comes to decisions, the leader I want to be, right? I'm projecting out and I go, what would the leader I'm striving to become do? And then that's the decision I make, because every time I make a decision, I am striving to be the leader I'm projecting myself to become. And every step I'm, going towards that. So it's the same thing in my personal life. There was recently there was a guy that had a flat tire on the side of the road, and I was on my way to work, and I stopped and I said, what would the man I want to be known as do in this situation? And I went out and I helped the guy change his tire, and I had to go back home and take a shower and change my clothes. But that was in the moment. I was like, that's the person I'm striving to be, and that's the decision I'm going to make. And that's kind of my barometer of how I make decisions in a leadership capacity.
David, that's really powerful. And I agree with you there. And I think we all fall short of that. I will tell you, yesterday, I was in Los Angeles and I saw a homeless person, and I actually had the same thought. But I was on my way to the airport, and there were other things that I had to do, and I was worried about my time. I let some things get in the way of it. It was just the right decision at the time. So I didn't do anything. I didn't give him any money. I didn't, talk to him about it, but perhaps I could have done it differently. So there are going to be times when we do things that where we don't always check those boxes, but I think you're absolutely right. And I would take it from me, and I'm not trying to convince your listeners to be religious people, but for me, I actually think that I like to ask myself a second question, and that is, what does God want me to do? Mm-hmm. And that is even more difficult. But if you could hold yourself somehow to that standard most of the time, you'd actually find you make a lot of good decisions.
What I tell people and what I strive for is I'm searching for patterns of success. I want repeatable patterns of success. And so I tell my management team, just go with it, make a gut call, and just make sure that you're creating patterns of success. If your patterns are starting to cause a line of failures, now it's time to recheck and say, hey, what's going on? What am I doing wrong? Because we've run into this pattern of failures. And if you have one failure in a string of successes, oh well. And I tell my younger employees to have a short-term memory, get over those losses. Don't base your whole, existence on your failures. You've got to get back up and go after more successes, because it's the overall pattern of success. So if you're at 85% successful decisions, you're a successful leader.
Absolutely. No question about it.
And I think that first comment, that the kind of book that you guys were alluding to, though, it's something that I always preach, is be the change that you want to see in the world. Don't all these people will just they're just going to talk about something, and it's like, be the change. Like, literally, it can start with you. That one itty bitty little catalyst that has all the ripples and the reverberations that make something really positive and powerful. Franklin
Graham one time said, who's the son of Billy Graham, the truth of what you say is told by what you do. He said,
"Oh, I love that."
You know what? It's one thing to talk the talk, but it's another to walk the walk. And people watch when you walk the walk.
Absolutely.
Oh yeah, those are the stories they tell, right and wrong.
Yeah.
And along those lines, like what do you see as the future for leadership of organizations?
I think that, John, I sit on 3 corporate boards now. And the one thing I've seen over the years, because I used to sit on Prologis's board too, is the importance of human capital in organizations. Um, I think there's a tight labor market today. Keeping good people is really key. Um, and one of the organizations that I'm on the board of, well, number one, all of our board meetings, we go through, let's just say, and this is an organization with 22,000 employees. So, but I'd say we go through the top 30 or so employees in the company, top meaning that's the top level, almost every year. Probably every year to a year and a half, we'll go through and we actually put their faces up on, and we talk about not just what they're good at, strong at, and not so strong at, but what we're doing to enhance their knowledge and to train them better at what they do. I would venture that most board of directors don't go to that level of detail, but the fact that we're beginning to do that shows how much interest they put in human capital in their organization. And I do think that we're seeing more and more of that because people realize that and I think it's a generational thing. I think the younger generation today thinks a lot more about what the culture is like in the organization. And if they don't like it, they're leaving. And by the way, that was completely different whenever I grew up in the 70s and the 80s. I mean, I might not like my culture, but I'm probably not going to leave because I needed a job. Mm-hmm. And unemployment was higher back then. And it just was much more transactional. It wasn't emotional. It's like, this is a transaction. I go to work, they pay me a paycheck. That's not the case anymore today. People leave. They don't like what they see. They leave. They don't like their leader. They leave, And I think as a result of that, it's probably we're moving in the right direction in terms of how companies are beginning to think about their employees and manage their employees. But we still have this notion of pride and fear. And, we all have those things, we all have those demons that we got to get over as leaders. I just think there's a lot more focus today on how we do it better.
I agree. I like that. And kind of a couple final questions I'd like to ask. Dave, did you have something to that?
Yeah, I just want to, before we get into the ending questions, I want to ask, is Primanti Brothers the best sandwich in the world?
Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. The best time to eat a Primanti Brothers sandwich is after midnight.
Excellent.
And I have to tell you, a couple times I had too much to drink when I had it, but boy, it sure tasted great. But I don't know if you know, but they make sandwiches by putting French fries on the sandwich itself. Like they put the whole thing together.
I'm a big fan.
Yeah.
I grew up, I went to high school in Weirton, West Virginia in the Northern Panhandle,
Sure.
right next to Star Lake Amphitheater, and went to WVU. So I'm very familiar with Pittsburgh. But yeah, I love Primanti Brothers sandwiches. The first time I had one, I was like, coleslaw and French fries on a sandwich?
Right.
It's amazing.
It's totally amazing. Yeah. And the location that they started at downtown is just, it's become really hot because that whole area of Pittsburgh has actually grown and attracted a lot of younger people. What's that?
Is that the meat?
The old meat packing district.
Yeah. So we actually have a restaurant here in Jacksonville that the owner's from Pittsburgh. And of course, he doesn't call it the Primanti Brothers sandwich, but it's called a Pittsburgh sandwich. And it's essentially a Primanti Brothers sandwich. And it's awesome.
That's great. Yeah. That's really great.
I love marketing. Like, just call it the Pittsburgh sandwich. People know what it is. So is there anything that we didn't discuss or cover today that the world should know?
Well, I would just say this. When I wrote the book Transfluence, by the way, Transfluence stands for transformational influence. And it's actually not a word. Transfluent is a word, but not transfluence. So it's hard for me to believe we actually created something that sounds like a word that's not a word in the dictionary. But The book, again, is really about leadership, getting out of your own way, leading other people. It's not about you, it's about them. How do we do that? And I'd say that there's, just to sum up that book, the world is changing rapidly. I think people expect more from leaders today because we live in a world of glass houses where through social media, everybody can see everything you do. And by the way, everybody's criticizing the things that you do too, and can publicly do that. I think the second thing is that leaders have to adapt to that changing environment. Can't get away with command and control leadership anymore. Have to be much more empathetic in the things that you're doing in terms of leadership. And the third thing is that the world craves leaders that they can trust. And so how do you build trust? You build it by compartmentalizing your internal storms, like we talk about, being more transparent, being much more communicative, and leading with values. And so that's the summation of the book. And I hope that whoever is watching this today will go out and buy it. It was a labor of love to write it, but I think there's a lot of good wisdom in there.
Absolutely. I think that's a solid plug, and I think people will. So how can people get a hold of you?
Well, people can get a hold of me through my website, number one, which is waltrakowich.com. I'll spell that WaltRakowich.com. I'm also on Twitter at Walt Rakowich, and I have a LinkedIn address, Walter Rakowich, and one of those three places would be a good place to start.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for joining us today. This was fantastic. Really appreciate it.
My pleasure. Great to be on. Good to see you both. David, thank you too.
Hope you enjoyed our episode. Please subscribe and review wherever you can. And if you would like to join the Digital Mastermind, go ahead and shoot me an email at jon@digitalmastermind.com or visit us at digitalmastermind.com. We'll see you next time. Thanks. Bye now.